All right. Welcome to the last Wednesday in May. Today is National Chardonnay Day. Yes, that's a real thing apparently. But I'm going to ask you to refrain from joining that celebration until after we conclude our webinar. You know, a lot of these times on these webinars, we focus on the more micro level. And that might take the form of products or an individual home or maybe an entire development. Well, we're going to expand our scope today to the municipal level and discuss how companies, developers, building professionals, municipalities, and yes, even individuals can interpret climate data and transform it into useful insights about climate vulnerabilities. Insights can help inform decisions about equitable adaptation strategies. We'll even look at examples from several communities addressing direct property impacts, critical access and mobility challenges, and social vulnerabilities. Here to walk through these examples are Karin Rogers and Jeff Hicks. Karin currently serves as Interim Director for UNC Asheville's National Environmental Modeling and Analysis Center, also known as NEMAC. In this position, she serves as team leader for several major collaborations and partnerships, including those with the USDA Forest Service's Eastern Forest Environmental Threat Assessment Center, NOAA's Climate Program Office and National Centers for Environmental Information, as well as state, county, municipal, and regional governments. Now, Jeff Hicks is the co-founder and CEO of Fernleaf Interactive, which is the private sector side of the NEMAC and Fernleaf public-private partnership. He's a strategic thinker with a talent for bridging systems thinking, technology, and people. While pursuing a degree in ecology, he was drawn to geographic information systems as the intersection of technology and the environment, an intersection that has become his passion, as we'll see today. Now, our sponsor today is PowerShift by NV Energy. It's a program that helps residential and business customers conserve energy and save money on their power bills. PowerShift is a one-stop resource to find energy-efficient products and services. For more information, please visit nvenergy.com/PowerShift. Now, we want to hear from you, so please use the questions box on the right side of your screen to send in your questions. I'll review those and pose them to Karin and Jeff during the Q&A time that we've set aside after their presentation. Now, Jeff, we'll start with you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. Really appreciate it. Yeah, great tidbit on the National Chardonnay Day. As it turns out, today is my nephew's 21st birthday. So I think I shall buy him a glass of Chardonnay, or maybe he should buy it since now he can't. All right, so thank you so much for the intro. As Mike had mentioned, we are a public-private partnership that focuses on resilient solutions. As he'd mentioned, Karin represents the public side at NEMAC, which is an applied research center based here in Asheville, North Carolina, that was founded in 2003 with the goal of helping to make climate data more readily available to communities and businesses who need to access that for making better decisions. Fernleaf Interactive is a small business spinoff, as he said. Karin and I have been working together for, we won't disclose how many years now through these auspices, but really with the idea of helping to get some of these public pieces out into the hands of people who need it, when the research side of things isn't sufficient. I also, before we jump in full, I want to announce a little presentation challenge that I'm doing. I have several cats who have a tendency of showing up during presentations like this. And so each time one of my cats shows up, I'm going to be keeping tabs, and we'll be making a $100 donation to Irene Wortham Center, which is a phenomenal nonprofit here in Asheville that focuses on helping people with economic and developmental challenges to live full lives. So as had been mentioned earlier, we're based in Asheville, which is in North Carolina in the mountains. There's a few things that you could say about Asheville, but one of the things that's most relevant for us is that the saying is, this is where weather data goes to retire, along with a lot of other people and other things. But the National Centers for Environmental Information, this is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's data center, where they keep a lot of satellite, weather station information. All that information comes here to Asheville to retire. But there's a group of us headquartered at the Collider and several other entities here in Asheville who are working on taking those data and making those, making new products and new insights out of those. So when we talk about the climate challenge, there's really this correlation of several factors that are coming together that are making things really challenging for the cities that we live in. Of course, all of our many of our communities are growing, and they're growing rapidly. But at the same time, we're seeing this increase in billion-dollar disasters, whether that's flooding or drought or wildfires, that are increasing. So we're putting more people in harm's way. Of course, the challenges are getting more intense. And of course, the bond rating agencies have taken note of this. So cities look to borrow more money to deal with the challenges that they're facing. They're potentially at risk of having that money be much more expensive to borrow because of the physical risk that bond rating agencies are perceiving. In short, our nation can't afford to do business as usual, and we can't afford to resist climate change. In other words, we can't build up physical barriers and harden every single piece of infrastructure that we need across our country. That's not practical. So as we think about resilience, we tend to show people this series of visuals to think through what resilience really is and how we think about it. So as we think about a community in the services that we take for granted, that when we turn on a light switch or turn on a faucet, or that we can just drive to work, we take a lot of those community services for granted. But when a hazard event like a hurricane or a flood or wildfire happens, it knocks our communities off of that baseline. And sometimes we can cross these tipping points where it takes a substantially long amount of time, a lot of resources to hopefully get back to the position where that community was before the event. But in a lot of cases, what we see happen is that the communities never quite bounce back to where they were before this event happened. So as we think about what the goal of resilience is, it's making these small investments now to make our communities better places to live. This isn't an insurance policy. This is making our communities more livable, better places, so that when those events happen, and we're not knocked so far off that baseline that we don't cross those critical tipping points and can bounce back much more affordably, faster, into the level that we were before. When we think about resilience too, we think about it as this intersection of three critical factors that all add together to help to create these comprehensive way of thinking about communities. That includes the social equity, sustainability, of course, and then those adaptation components. In short, with the social equity component of resilience, the focus there is addressing historical inequities that are places that are impacted first and worst, the frontline communities that don't have the resources to bounce back more quickly and need special attention. Similarly, for the sustainability side of the ledger, we encourage adopting practices that are going to mitigate the contributions to climate change so that we're not making things worse for ourselves as we go along. And finally, adaptation, which is improving our communities to deal with the current and future threats there. One thing I want to mention is that one size does not fit all. There are some great resources that we'll share with you. But there are some things to consider that, as depending on which part of the country you're in, be thinking about some of these specific hazards that are more applicable to your location. But that is a critical consideration, is to recognize that something that might work for Miami may not work very well for Des Moines. But there may be some things that do. It's just sort of recognizing that. And as I'd mentioned before about the, sort of the economic case for resilience, resilience isn't an insurance policy that is cashed in case, if there happens to be an event. We are seeing that resilient cities that are making these steps forward are increasingly competitive economically versus their peers who are less resilient. This is becoming a very important factor for companies and individuals who look to move to different cities. So Karin is going to talk to us a little more about some of the national resources that many of which are things that we've participated in or helped develop, or some of them are friends and colleagues at other organizations. But yeah, Karin will take it away from here.
Thanks, Jeff. Right. So as Jeff said, we've worked with a handful of communities and municipalities in their kind of resilience efforts and resilience assessments, and through a lot of our process of partnering with them, but also the partners we have here locally in Asheville with NOAA and NCEI and others, it's been there. It's real clear how that there are a handful of national resources that are go-to tools for us, and when we're looking and working with municipalities to look at their resilience. And the first one that we're presenting here is the kind of federal flagship product called the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit, which we actually helped co-develop along with NOAA and in partnership with the USGCRP, which is the U.S. Global Change Research Program, and all the federal partners among that. But this is really kind of the go-to resource for information about resilience. You can find the URL is on actually each one of these slides. We'll be providing this presentation to you if you're interested. But this particular product is at toolkit.climate.gov, and you can find a lot of information about case studies about other communities and how they've approached resilience, tools that they've used, and also one large part of this is the steps to resilience. And so this is kind of a standard tailored assessment process, step process to resilience that we use, a lot of our partners used in trying to drive in. And essentially it starts with looking at your threats, understanding then what your vulnerabilities and risks will be. Like Jeff was saying, these are the threats we're facing are vary across the nation, and so it's really important to kind of get a better idea of what those could be for your locality. Then moving into options and kind of understanding what solutions and strategies you have to be able to address them, and then to understand, well, we can't do everything, resources are limited. How do you prioritize and plan? And then finally take action. And so this particular process is something that we use with each one of our partners, and we believe it leads to these transparent and very defensible priorities, and it increases the capacity for municipal staff to be able to actually address and look at climate threats and be able to do something about it. So as we were saying, we're becoming more and more familiar with the stressors, the climate stressors that we're facing across the nation, from increasing heavy precipitation, drought, temperature variability, sea level rise. Those are some of the big ones. But there's compounding other stressors that we look at that kind of add to the entire idea of looking at resilience. So population growth and affordable housing, and our evolving energy reality. These are things that are topics that we have to address as we're looking at resilience, and the tools that we're mentioning here actually do a good job of kind of giving you some of the information as you start going down this path. So here are examples of some of the tools that we are go-to products for us that are on a national scale. We've kind of divided them into 3 different categories. Some of them are really good at giving you basically the setting the scene, giving you an idea of what climate trends and historic and projections are for your town, your community, your state. Some go further and actually give you more information about how some of these changing climate threats and hazards impact assets and things that you value. Things like critical infrastructure or vulnerable populations. And then some even go further to actually give you an idea of where you're actually facing some heightened vulnerability and risk. And so I'm going to quickly just kind of go through some of these because they all provide some really key pieces of information in the whole resilience picture. Again, each one of these is going to have the URLs that you can visit each one of these at a later time. The first one is the Climate Explorer, which is, again, one of the key tools on the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit. it starts with the ability to search by location. So you put in your county, your city, your zip code, and it produces, and it basically gives you some really key information about climate projections and historical weather data. Perhaps it gives you information about high tide flooding if you're in a coastal area. And it also gives you a lot of spatial information about climate data. And so again, this is kind of for us, a go-to product. It's something that we actually also help co-produce with our partners at NOAA. But to kind of give you a good sense of what your climate reality is right now. Similarly, NOAA has a tool called Climate at a Glance, and this is another way of accessing, historic information about in your county or city, about how, what the trends look like, how have they changed over time, in relation to like precipitation or temperature. It's great because you can kind of narrow in on a time scale, and you can download the data, but it gives you a good kind of, as it says, a glance of what your climate reality is, right, for your area. And we use this a lot to just kind of illustrate what communities are facing and the change that they're seeing. If you're interested in looking at a little bit of a larger scale, so I highly recommend looking at these state climate summaries that are also produced by NOAA and the National Center for Environmental Information. So this is kind of in conjunction, a partner project with the National Climate Assessment, which again is the federal go-to standard for climate data. And this particular site gives you some really good high-level understanding of key messages, things that your state would be or will be we're expecting for you to experience. Things like this here for North Carolina, we're seeing a change in the number of very warm nights that are happening, and that's significant, especially for those vulnerable populations, say that ones that don't have air conditioning, so this particular resource is a really good place to look high level for maybe what your state is experiencing. The next one, another NOAA product, but again, a really helpful one if you're looking for statistics about events. So to understand how many hurricanes may have happened, in my community, or I mean, there's a lot of different types of events in this database, from blizzards, number of blizzards, to drought, to floods, to hurricanes, and it's by county, and it gives you some really interesting statistics, not only the number of events that you've seen, but also how what the property damage was, or if there were injuries or deaths related to any of these. So another really good resource for getting kind of a snapshot of what these events look like for your county. I really recommend, if you're interested or need or want information about drought, another NOAA product is the Drought.gov. It's the National Integrated Drought Information System. They've relaunched recently and have a really excellent dashboard for investigating by locality. So by location, you can search for temperature and precip information. It's a little bit more near real time, and it's a shorter time frame, but it gives you some really great information also about historical conditions related to drought, and has these great graphics that show you when you've maybe experienced extreme drought, and how that trend is changing with time. The next one is, now this next tool kind of starts to get into a little bit more of this idea of exposure. And so we were saying how when you not only we're seeing changes in the number of threats and hazards that are happening, but you want to know how they may be impacting specific assets that you care about. And so this particular tool, again, we partnered with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation on their coastal resilience evaluation and siting tool called CREST. It's another national scale tool for coastal areas. I think on the next slide, you'll see that it has the watersheds. It gives you a really good sense of how and where in these watersheds certain assets, community assets, and as well as natural assets, some fish and wildlife, how they're impacted by specific coastal threats and hazards, things like storm surge and flooding, sea level rise. Again, it's a very spatial tool, but you can get a lot of good information and ability to compare different areas to each other. I also highly suggest looking at a tool called Neighborhoods at Risk. This is developed by a group called Headwaters Economics. When we start, Jeff had mentioned the concept of social vulnerability. This particular tool actually does a really good job of giving you the ability to look at your community and search by community and give you an idea of what the exposure is for some of these at-risk neighborhoods, and using some of these metrics to look at social vulnerability, such as, households with no car, or people of color, Hispanic, or housing units that are rentals. There's all sorts of different metrics you can look at and how they intersect and how they are exposed to specific threats. One example I like to show is the next one is so for here we have an example of Savannah, Georgia, and where I was interested to see where are some of these vulnerable populations, and where in Savannah do they have actually very low percent tree canopy, right? So tree, as we know, urban tree canopy is an important thing when you're especially dealing with things like extreme heat. And so it gives you really good spatial, idea of where that city is more exposed to specific threats like extreme heat. I highly recommend looking at this, because not only can you do that kind of exploration, but there's also another panel where you can actually look at climate projections similar to some of the other products we have here. Here, giving example of what heat and precipitation are going to look, how they're going to look like in the next 25 years, and they give these really good kind of summary statistics at the top there, where Savannah is expected to experience an 82% increase in extremely hot days in the next 25 years. That's a big deal. And so that kind of information this particular tool is very good at giving that kind of summary. As we know, sea level rise is something that's on the mind of a lot of coastal communities. NOAA's sea level rise viewer is really good at showing different sea level rise scenarios from 1 feet all the way to 10 feet. What does that look like? What does that mean for the communities? This is a nice interactive tool to use. And then I think the last one is similar, but this is the FEMA National Risk Index. And so this is, again, another national resource where you can look at county level as well as census tract information to understand where some of these socially vulnerable populations are and how they intersect and are more exposed to specific threats, to numerous threats that I've mentioned before, but highly recommend exploring this tool as well. So these, I've kind of just given you a whole list of at least 10 different national tools that we use to give us a good context as when we're approaching resilience, but really it comes down to decisions are made at a local level, at a local scale, and that's kind of where we're going to take it next, and Jeff will pick up here to talk more about local action.
Awesome, thank you, Karin. Really appreciate it. And yeah, she probably wasn't tooting NEMAC's horn enough, but NEMAC was sort of behind a lot of that. Great group, a lot of great resources. As Karin said, though, there are some unique challenges when we start working at a community scale. And I know this scene probably won't look too unfamiliar to folks who've been involved in a lot of community visioning sort of sessions where it's, hey, we want to talk about what's important to us as a community, gather stakeholder input, and drive our decisions accordingly. What we unfortunately see, though, is that oftentimes that good intent and that desire and that information ends up buried in a report somewhere that's not actionable. In other words, it dies on a shelf in many cases, and that statement of community need and that community buy-in and interest, we find in a lot of cases gets lost. So a big part of our innovation jointly between NEMAC and Fernleaf, obviously at the national scale and all the way down to the local scale, is to help get these community identified needs to not end up in a report, but end up with shovel-worthy projects on the ground that are fundable and are implemented in ways that help the communities do the things that they need to do. But it takes a little bit of a different approach at this very local scale. A lot of those resources that Karin had mentioned are phenomenal resources for helping to understand a lot of the context and helping to start identifying the challenges. In a lot of cases, then to get to that next level of understanding, we have to get all the way down to the individual building level throughout an entire community. So I like to show people this picture, and my niece was in the car with me when I was driving down the street, and I think she thought I was completely nuts when I suddenly pulled over because I saw this, and it was a perfect illustration of a concept I like to tell folks about. Karin and I have both mentioned, I think, exposure and vulnerability a few times, and I think that this image really helps to illustrate. So you've got both of these homes that are next door to each other are both in a flood zone area. Okay, so when there's storm surge, both of these homes flood, but they're very different. So they're both exposed to the flooding, but they're very different in the amount of vulnerability that they have. I'll give you a quick hint. I would rather I'd rather own the home that's elevated than the one that's on grade there. So as we think about doing that, there's a different collection of information that's needed. And a lot of local governments, of course, keep very good information on where their homes and businesses and critical facilities are. And we think it's important to think about those independently, because how we would adapt an apartment building, for example, may vary tremendously from how we would adapt a hospital. So as we think about those different assets, we similarly think about the different threats, because as we might adapt to one type of flooding, that adaptation strategy may be very different than what we might do for extreme heat or wildfire. But bringing those two pieces together at that local scale can help us understand what's exposed. But this is where those local regulations, the local property use and local building codes can come in to help us understand what were the ordinances that were in place, for example, when that building was constructed that have to do with that type of threat? Was there some sort of freeboard requirement or a base floor elevation that would elevate it out of the floodplain, for example, is a good sort of easy to understand example of that. So as we do that kind of analysis at the asset scale, then there are four primary types of local insights that we find to be very helpful for folks at that city scale. So these are a few examples we'll show from cities such as Charleston, West Palm Beach, Tallahassee, New Bern, North Carolina. There's a variety of different examples in here that are kind of going to pop around. But so when we first start off with thinking about where we have those properties and the services that are vulnerable, there's a few things that are interesting and helpful. So again, as we've mentioned, we think about those different assets so that we can help to drive action where it's most needed. One thing that we see sometimes communities do is they'll do a vulnerability assessment, but only on the critical facilities as sort of a proxy for the rest of the community. One thing that we often find, though, is that critical facilities don't always map to things like where there's homes that might have vulnerability. And so by doing this asset scale assessment, then action can be driven to the specific neighborhoods that may have a high proportion of critical facilities, of course, but there should be some corresponding considerations made for neighborhoods that may have a disproportionate number of homes, for example, that may be vulnerable. The second type of insight that we usually provide is also economic impact. So recognizing that when we say, this vulnerable business versus that one, oftentimes the more important vulnerability is not necessarily the loss of the structure itself, or even sometimes the contents of the structure. Often those are insured, but sometimes the bigger disruption that can happen is the fact that nobody can get, that there's a disruption of business and commerce that's taking place at that location. So in other words, employees can't get to work, they can't work the day to get their wage. And in a lot of cases, we see this in businesses where people can't afford to miss a day's wage. So as we think about the economic impacts, this can also help to drive action to understand not just where we might have physical vulnerability, but where we may have vulnerability to the economic viability of the community and the people who work in that community. The third type is critical access and mobility. We see this kind of thing all the time, where you may have an entire neighborhood where the homes are high and dry, that there's, none of the homes are flooding, except there's a single point of access that is cut off during a flood, for example. We've seen some tragic examples of this with wildfire, for example, in gated communities where there's only one single point of access. A fire may start from there. No one can get out of the neighborhood. So understanding where there's these critical access points that may be cut off is equally important as understanding which specific assets themselves may be affected. And then finally, as we've talked about for social vulnerability, this is a critical insight that we see a lot in historically how the industry or sort of how FEMA and the federal government and others have prioritized action has been around benefit costs, which is ultimately focused around losses. Okay, and that typically tends to skew the actions to parts of the communities that are more affluent, oftentimes more white, because that's where a lot of the expensive infrastructure is. That then, of course, is where the risk is. So that tends to be where the actions are prioritized. By including measures of social vulnerability as we're understanding physical vulnerability and these other factors, we can oftentimes see some cases like this in New Bern, where a few socioeconomically disadvantaged neighborhoods within the community bears a disproportionate number of homes that are flooding during these extreme events. So helping to identify that might otherwise get lost in an otherwise sort of reductionist loss-based view can be really helpful in guiding actions that can be very, very targeted and equitable. One thing, and this is, and again, to throw a few more resources, and especially because this is, we'll make the slides available. We could do an entire conversation around this, and this is incredibly important. To talk about social equity. Social vulnerability is not the same as social equity. There's certainly a lot of additional things that have to be considered through the entire application of a process. And fortunately, there's some phenomenal resources out there, and we have some links in here as people are thinking through the process of taking equitable action to then get funding for projects and things like that. There's some great resources here for that. And then at the risk of getting chucked out for suitcasing here, we did mention this elsewhere. We also produce a product called Acceladap that's at the city scale, that communities that we work with, a lot of these very localized insights. This is a staff-based tool that focuses on helping them to get these spatial assessments with these values-based lenses at that local scale with these regular updates. And then finally, one thing I want to mention is that in terms of sort of where we fit within the overall sort of tapestry as we see, and to try and kind of bring all of this together, as you see those national resources, and Karin went through a lot of those, there's still in some cases that we see a gap between those national resources and the decision makers and the community scales, across geographies and sectors. And where we've been focusing a lot of our effort is recognizing that these communities have these relationships with practitioner partners, many of whom are listed here that we work with. Some of these are major architecture and engineering, civil engineering firms who do a lot of the work that communities rely on for designing and building their infrastructure. So increasingly where we are finding ourselves fitting in is working in tandem with those practitioner partners to help them power the work that they're doing with additional analysis and this partner enablement that we do. So as we kind of wrap up here, I think this is we really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all. And I think it's important for us to think about the fact that, you know, those of us who are on this call today are not going to be around to experience the changes that the things that we build are going to experience. In other words, the homes that our great grandchildren will live in are going to be sitting in a very different climate than we are currently sitting in. And so I think, you know, the more that we can take climate change into consideration about the things that we build and the decisions that we're making today, the better off, you know, we are going to be as a society. And so to kind of cap all of this off, I know this sentiment has been expressed in many ways and in many cultures, but the basic gist is, you know, blessed are those who plant trees under whose shade they will never sit. I think this is a webinar of folks who are natural tree planters who think a lot about those who are going to sit in that shade. And for that, we really appreciate it. And we appreciate this opportunity to share some thoughts with you all. And want to thank you for your time and attention today. And thanks to Mike and Mary for facilitating this conversation.
Well, thank you, sir. And thank you to Karin for talking with us. We're going to go ahead and take questions from our guests. And being the moderator, I get to go first sometimes. So I am going to take the opportunity to go first and ask a couple questions of you. So I'm familiar with the Institute for Business and Home Safety, or IBHS. And I know that it's not at the same macro level, but what kind of role can they play in all of this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's a few different pieces as we think about the roles that our physical infrastructure, especially the buildings that we're going to be building, that you know will house the residents and the jobs and the commerce that we're going to do in the future. So think about the more that we can draw on climate data to make infrastructure decisions about those designs of the buildings. Sometimes those are very localized decisions, of course, and things about, you know, are you in a floodplain or not? There's a lot of regulation around that. But some of the things that aren't as, you know, regulated that could be valuable is to think about things like, you know, let's look at something like Climate Explorer to say, okay, this building that we're building right now, what is the time series of cooling degree days, for example, as we look into the future? Right, as we're thinking about HVAC loads, are we thinking about the right size of infrastructure as we look at, you know, cooling degree days possibly increasing by 50% or possibly even doubling within the lifespan of certain pieces of infrastructure? So there's certainly some aspects from that perspective. There's also certainly plenty of examples from, I think it was Hurricane Harvey. I think we all remember that site of the one house that was standing there and everything else was gone. There's obviously a lot of things that can be decided and implemented on a building scale that can help us be much more resilient.
I didn't know if Karin wanted to chime in or not there, but no, okay.
I think Jeff got that pretty well.
I kind of have the same question about the Resilient Design Institute. I didn't know if that's another organization that you've been able to interface with or not. And so I just kind of the same question, but different organization and a little bit of a different scope for them too.
Right.
Okay, so we have a question coming in from Robert. He wanted to know, is the insurance industry involved with any of this? So not IBHS, but just more insurance or reinsurance companies, or did they conduct their own research, or do they kind of try and blend their own research with what you all come up with? Can you talk a little bit about how they're involved?
Sure. Karin, you want to go first, and or you want me to touch on that one?
Yeah, you go for it. I mean, I think you're a little closer.
Yeah, that's a great question about insurance. You know, we have had some conversations with folks in the insurance and reinsurance space. Historically, our observation has been that they are somewhat tight-lipped about exactly what they're drawing on. We've been a part of, so being here with the data center, we've facilitated a number of data discovery days that I think we facilitated one that, you know, not that this is insurance. I mean, I think we've we've had, like Munich Re and stuff come, but BlackRock, for example, was there, and they were there to say, hey, how do we take a better understanding about, as we're making these trillion-dollar investments, what should we be thinking about in terms of our portfolio? And what we found is in some cases, there's even some hesitation to even let, folks of us who work in partnership with the federal government to create data products to put them out there, that sometimes they're even hesitant to even tell us what they're using out of fear that it may give some competitive advantage to a competitor. We know for a fact that they are very active in this. Of course, you'd have to be. You have to be kind of have your head in the sand if you weren't in insurance, thinking about the kinds of risks in your portfolio. But from our kind of perspective is where we fit in, and of course we have conversations with the folks at Moody's and other bond rating agencies. But where we're kind of coming from is from the city perspective, is to help them increase their viability through programs like the community rating system. There's some of those things where effectively then the flood insurance premiums go down, and there's a variety of bond rating agencies who are getting clearer about the guidance of what types of things are out there to lower the risk. We know there's the Task Force on Climate related financial disclosures, and so there's some increasing guidance in the financial space, of which the insurance and reinsurance are a part, are increasingly providing more guidance on specific actions that cities can do to help lower their rates and increase their bond ratings.
I'm glad you mentioned the flood insurance program, because for a long time now, that's been kind of a mess. And that's probably putting it nicely.
Yeah, that's a very generous way of putting it there, Mike.
Yeah. Read, and they had some reforms that passed, and then they reversed those reforms. And so I would hope that this kind of data and information would be helping to feed logical decision making on some of that, but maybe that's being too optimistic. But I do have a question from Danielle that's kind of along these lines a little bit. With the change in presidential administration, has the shift in focus to more climate-facing and sustainable efforts, has that filtered down to initiatives like this yet? And if not, do you expect it to, or has the change in administration really has no effect at all?
Yeah, great question, Danielle. And I'll stop sharing my screen. I think was that a good move, or should I turn it back on? I just figured, hey, I don't want to just have the screen up. Great question, Danielle. One thing I will say, and we are fortunate working with several federal agencies to have some visibility into the administration and, or at least their priorities. I am very encouraged at this point of how proactive they have been and how quickly that is filtering down. The administration is not waiting around on this one, and there are some interesting nuances and programs that they're putting out that are helping every day. The CARES Act funding, for example, that is one of the stipulations on the funding that local governments receive, is that it can be used for equitable resilience projects, for example. That's been a tremendous boon to a number of communities who otherwise, sometimes these things are things that you can fit within your typical capital budgets within a city, right? I mean, if you have a stormwater program and you're making stormwater capital investments, there's investments you can make that would make your stormwater system more adaptive, right? But there's sometimes some big ticket purchases that is just going to be very difficult to find funding for. This administration has made it pretty clear that they're ready to help with that. I don't know if you all saw the press release that came out of the White House. I think it was 2 days ago. The president is committed to doubling the amount of funding in FEMA's BRIC program, which is the Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. This is a competitive program that communities throughout the nation can submit project ideas and then get funding for those. So this is a tremendous time and opportunity for our communities to really take a big step forward here.
Eric had a question. He said, can you describe how the tree canopy information is used by local communities? Because while you mentioned extreme heat, increased tree canopy can contribute to cleaner air as well.
Right. Karin, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think there's multiple benefits, right, from an urban tree canopy. But I think this, with the example I was showing specifically with the neighborhood at risk tool, it's kind of it's trying to target and understand where there really is just a lack of tree canopy, and where the city could then spend their resources to to essentially improve their adaptive capacity, right? So this idea of when a really hot event happens, like in Savannah, Georgia, when we're expecting an 82% increase in heat events in the next 25 years, where they are going to have to bolster up their their shade. And it's probably, when we're working with these cities, we're not just talking about that as a singular solution. Oftentimes it's in conjunction with other strategies, things that are there, outdoor, play areas, water splash, places, cooling centers, all sorts of things when we're looking at threats like that. But with natural-based solutions, kind of these tree canopy, vegetation and that kind of thing, obviously has a multiple benefit. So it's usually on the table when working with municipalities as a go-to solution. Some of these green ideas, green solutions.
You showed a lot of different resources, access to all sorts of data. That is pretty cool. I had a question about when you're looking up some of the climate data that you outlined, and I know there were a lot of different databases or different sources, but what kind of time spans are available for that information? Is it breaking it down like on monthly, or is it yearly, or what? Can you kind of give us a sense for what you're going to get on an output?
Yeah, it depends on the variable that you're looking at, right? I mean, a lot of, and things like precipitation, historic data has to do with, how many, gauges are out there physically, monitoring a lot of that information. And some of them have only been around for 50 years. Some of them have been around for 100. So you may, there's some data sets that'll go back pretty far. There's some that won't. So yeah, and the time variable. And then, when you're looking at drought, that type of, there's concepts of long-term drought. There's flash drought, which is, something that happens over a matter of weeks. And a lot of rural communities are looking at how that impact, that particular impact and what that means. And so the time scale varies depending on what particular variable you're looking at. But usually in these tools, it gives you some guidance of like, what is the go-to, time frame to really be doing this analysis. I think that's what I find useful in a lot of these tools, that you're not doing this alone and having, it is a trusted source of data that tells you essentially how to, use and interpret a lot of the information.
Because I know the more frequent the data points, obviously, sometimes the more helpful it can be. So whether it goes back 30 years or 100 years,
yeah.
It's kind of like, well, all right, is this every month is plotted out, or is it just once a year plotted out, or whatever?
Yeah. Well, and it depends. I mean, you're trying to get a good context of change, right? And sometimes 50 years is helpful.
Right. I'm thinking about, one of the cool things about having the data center here in Asheville is they have a couple of really interesting pieces of data. For example, I think they have, it's like George Washington's little field notebook where he kept track of, the weather on his farm every afternoon or something. There's little things like that where, I mean, when he wasn't otherwise occupied, I think he got pretty busy towards the end. But anyway, so yeah, the data frequency or sort of the resolution is one question. One thing, just as a caveat on here, is that several of the resources that we pointed you all to, you can get information down to a very granular scale. But that's where, again, sometimes engaging the people who made it or groups, like ours and stuff can be helpful, because there can sometimes be things like, you'll see this all the time in climate projections where, a curve is going out and there might be a few zigzags here. And any given zig or zag in 50 years time may not necessarily, it doesn't mean that, 2051 is going to be 2 degrees warmer than 2052 or something like that, right? So there's some of those things where it's also helpful to understand where these things came from. But one thing that we're really encouraged, and there's somebody on Karin's team, Dave Michelson, who's an avid advocate for users, who is routinely thinking of, okay, how do we not push out these complex pieces that folks, the layperson doesn't know what to do with in a sensible way, but rather, can we put out information in a form that is valid and is easy to use? And I'm encouraged, that suite of tools that Karin shows you, it is, if we'd given this presentation 10 years ago, it would have been a complete mess, and a very different picture.
Getting better every year, yeah.
Getting better every year, yeah.
That's great. All right. Well, a couple more questions. And for our audience, please submit your questions via the questions box. We had one from Elizabeth. In the drought information system, can you search by city, state, zip code? How does that work?
Yeah, so it's Drought.gov, and I'm fairly certain you can search by county, by city and state. You can also search by sector, or if you're interested in agriculture or something else. I find it a very user-friendly interface to be able to get drought information, and it's just kind of up there on the top navigation bar. You can just enter in your locality.
Yeah, you can have way too much fun on that, because you can see time series and forecasts. It's an amazing resource.
Yeah, they've done a really nice job.
And as someone who has relatives in small towns, does it even get down as low as some of these smaller towns, or does it just say, well, the nearest metropolitan area is over here somewhere? Like, how does that work when you're talking about some really small towns?
Yeah, so with the drought product, I'm fairly certain this is a national product, and so they, like we're saying, resolution kind of changes depending on exactly where you are, but should be able to get fairly accurate information for, even some of the smallest suburban.
Awesome. In a lot of cases too, Mike, for the Climate Explorer, for example, at some point, a tiny city from a climatological standpoint, that's probably not sufficient in terms of geographic data to aggregate for, not to go like totally nerd out here, but in a lot of cases, what we have worked on is to aggregate at more the county scale. And so, it's a more representative, sort of a scientifically more reliable number. But yeah, with Climate Explorer or Drought.gov, you should be able to put in any location in the US and get information.
Okay. We also had a question from Jim. For the storm events database, does that only include named storms?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. So like named hurricanes, yes.
Yeah. And also named winter storms too, right?
Was the question only named storms, or was it?
Yeah.
So the question was, for that database, does it only include named?
Only. Oh, no. Not just named. They don't have to be of a certain size, actually. In fact, it's the gamut from small events to the biggest ones we've seen. So.
Yeah, that resource. Sorry, this was like one of the first projects that Fern worked on, as we went way into the storm events database. It's a product that is relies on reports that then are gathered by the local meteorological offices. So if there's like a newspaper article that says, hey, farmer X lost 3 cows during an event, a tornado last night, they make a note of that, and it all gets aggregated into this database. So there's a ton of events that have no losses, no damages or anything, But what's cool is every one of them has a narrative associated with it that's really helpful. So as you're, kind of triangulating on maybe there was an event and in a location, and you want to kind of understand everything that happened on it, it's a really good way of looking back at historical information. It's not comprehensive because it's relying on people reporting information. There's they'll tree fall in the wood, forest kind of thing. Is anybody around to hear it?
Right.
But in terms of it does capture a lot of very large events, of course.
Okay. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions, so I want to thank Karin and Jeff for sharing their time and their knowledge and all those resources with us today. Really appreciate it. Thank you both.
Thanks for having us.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it was our pleasure. And let us know if there's any questions that come in afterwards, and we'll follow up to provide the slides.
All right. Well, thank you to our audience for attending and asking great questions, and thank you to PowerShift by NV Energy for their generous sponsorship of this webinar. Our next webinar will take place on Wednesday, June 23rd at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. We're going to be talking with Mike Steffen of Walsh Construction about how his company has already utilized the Housing 2.0 principles into their business. And speaking of Housing 2.0, our Q2 workshop series is starting up next Thursday, June 3rd. If that is something you'd like to attend to gain further insight and knowledge into the housing industry's impending transformation, then you need to go to www.greenbuildermedia.com/housing-2.0 to find out more and register. I hope you all have a wonderful Memorial Day weekend. Stay safe, have some fun, and take care. Goodbye, everyone.